Hello and welcome to Make It Conscious. This is Max. Hope you're all doing very well today. It's been a while since I recorded any videos. Thought it was about time, did some catching up. And what inspired this actually was the fact that the YouTube channel has just passed 10,000 subscribers. So thank you very much. If you're new here, welcome. Most of you have been following the active imagination exercises. That seems to be one of the big draws of this. And that's certainly going to continue. I've got a course coming out in the not too distant future, all about the how to practice active imagination unguided. And I'd like to get some feedback from you about what else you might find interesting to talk about. There's lots of things that I want to talk about that I think are very important, very relevant. However, one has to balance that against the needs of the subscriber base as well. So feel free to let me know. It's going to be a slightly new format. I'm going to be experimenting here, not just with content, but with some camera positions. So there we go. I want to make a video really all about this topic of self-knowledge. I think there is no bigger topic, and it would be futile to try and cover all of it in one video. After all, that is the whole point of this channel. It's the whole point of my life, your life, everyone's lives. I think that the pursuit of genuine self-knowledge is the most important task that we have, and it's very pertinent to the world we find ourselves in now, for many reasons which I'll discuss in this video. But everything I talk about on this channel, everything that you see here that I ever have talked about and ever will talk about, is related to this idea of self-knowledge. And it's a curious topic because, well, it sounds kind of self-explanatory, right? Almost by definition. What is self-knowledge? Well, it's knowledge of the self. Okay, fine. At the same time, it is the deepest topic you'll ever get into. In fact, Khalil Gibran said, as we'll see in a second, that it is the mother of all knowledge, because all pursuit of knowledge is in fact driven by the need for self-knowledge, the drive towards self-knowledge. So I sort of use it interchangeably with this word spirituality. I think that spirituality and psychology are essentially both pursuits of self-knowledge, coming at it from different perspectives, obviously with different connotations, different implications, but essentially they're both talking about the same thing here. And so that's what Make It Conscious is really about. And I think it's an important pursuit. I'm certainly not the first to be thinking that. We're going to be looking at many great thinkers in this presentation here and what they had to say on the matter. So just want to say thank you, first of all. We've just passed the 10,000 subscriber mark on YouTube. That's awesome. That's a really great milestone. Came about rather quickly. I think at least half of that is probably down to that one video about active imagination, which was a rather quick article that I wrote on my website and then just spent quite some time with some help making AI images and producing actual audio recording. But it turned out to be a very popular video, had some feedback as well, constructive and unconstructive, and all of that has been taken on board. So I think it's fair to say that that is a part of the content that is clearly resonating with people, this talking to oneself in whatever form that takes. Jung called it active imagination. Humans have been doing it since before the birth of any civilization, right? It's the simple act of engaging with yourself. But that's an act we've more or less lost touch with in modern culture, at least, certainly modern Western culture. And that we, I think, are in desperate need of a resurgence of, and method and understanding around that whole idea and the theory behind it. You know, why is it even a thing to talk to yourself? Why does that matter? So there will be a lot more content around that coming forward. There's already probably nearing 110 guided exercises now on YouTube. And there's also the sister podcast where extended versions of those are being released. So huge thank you to all of you. I think most of you are here for that reason. And I trust, therefore, what I'm going to talk about here is also of interest, because it's really talking about the same thing. You know, active imagination is a tool of acquiring self-knowledge. Why do we acquire self-knowledge? Why does that matter? So if I asked you why self-knowledge matters, you might think that's a sort of fairly inane question, really. Of course it matters. Why would it not matter? If you don't know yourself, you're in big trouble. But what does it mean to know yourself? Well, if you ask the question, who am I? What kind of answer do you give? Is it your name, your job? Is it what you do? Is it your physical characteristics? Is it your personality? I mean, that's a bit of a rabbit hole. What is your personality? God knows there have been many attempts to measure and define personality, but none of them are fixed, and they all have great drawbacks, great shortfalls. The Myers-Briggs system was based on the work of Jung, which is based directly and indirectly on mystical traditions, the idea of the four elements, the four temperaments, the four modalities of consciousness, and that we each have a preference for them, and we do well to bring on board their opposites, integrate our shadow and aspects of ourselves we've left behind. So the question of who am I, no attempt to answer that will give you a full and comprehensive or even accurate for more than a moment answer. It's not a question you can really meaningfully do justice to the depth we need to go to in understanding ourselves. And as Alan Watts said, trying to define yourself is like trying to bite your own teeth, because how can the mind that is being described possibly define itself? Isn't that a bit of a paradox? The thing that is defining the thing is the thing. So there's no objectivity there necessarily. So the mind has to produce objectivity somehow, and that's a large part of the mystery right there. It's like, as he says, trying to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. It can't really be done. Not in the way that we might ordinarily think. And certainly if we're trying to do it with words, we're always going to fall short of what's really there. He talked about this at length and with great eloquency. Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese poet, said that the knowledge of the self is the mother of all knowledge. I think it's fair to say that, yes, the pursuit of all knowledge, whether it be scientific, psychological, spiritual, how to do something, how to drive a car, how to cook food, ultimately this is all serving this process of coming to know the self. And he goes on, so it is incumbent on me to know myself, to know it completely, to know its minutiae, its characteristics, its subtleties, and its very atoms. Now, it might sound like a tall order, but it almost sounds like he's saying, doesn't it, that we've got to understand the macro perspective, you've got to understand it completely in context. You've got to understand its subtleties and its very atoms right down to the finest detail, leaving no stone unturned. So making every aspect of ourselves conscious, perhaps. I'm not sure if that's exactly what he meant there, because there's divisions of thought on that and whether that's actually the spiritual goal. I tend to believe no, that the unconscious has a role. It will always be there. Certainly as long as we are individual, as human beings, we'll always have an unconscious. We'll always have a shadow. There'll always be parts of ourselves that we find undesirable, that lead to tension when experienced, that lead to some kind of pain. But it doesn't mean we don't make an effort to keep processing all of that and resolving all of that. And if we don't, that's actually arguably when the greatest consequences come. So that is the journey. But certainly we agree here on the fact that it is the ultimate task. It's the mother of all knowledge. But judging by the actions of many today, I think you could say that the avoidance of the self is actually kind of the norm. Anyone who comes to you with a problem, unless they're someone who's, say, coming to me for coaching, that's obviously an exception, because this is people who are taking responsibility for their mind. They recognize that their mind is playing a role, what they experience, as blameless as that is, there is something they can do about it. And yet, for the most part, the problems we see day to day, these are all solvable problems. Through transmuting them, we actually gain self-knowledge, but offer genuine solutions, because there are no quick fixes. And why would you want a quick fix? Because that would deny you the opportunity to actually grow. So genuine tools like active imagination, like divination, like the tarot, like monitoring how you behave and how you speak to people, choosing your profession carefully and wisely, bringing generosity into that profession, managing your thoughts in such a way, not controlling your thoughts, but being aware of how you think and what you think and influencing that, and allowing tension to be worked through. These are all really powerful solutions. They do actually work. They do move the mind forward. But it's all too common, isn't it, to hear folks complaining about a problem, but actually also denying a solution. So right there's a conflict, because you have to sort of question how much they really suffer through that problem if they're not really willing to solve it. If they're not really willing to grow in freedom by taking responsibility. And it doesn't mean there isn't something going on in their world that isn't unjust or completely heinous, but it does nonetheless mean that they can actually do something about it nonetheless. So as Sartre said, freedom is what you do with what's been done to you. So by and large, the idea of taking responsibility for our own mind, all that entails, because that entails a lot, by the way, but captured in that small phrase, it's not a very popular idea, generally speaking. Responsibility on a more pragmatic level, yeah, that's understood, and we do that. But if we can understand that when we take a pragmatic approach, that what we're really aiming for is self-knowledge, then we can take full responsibility. We can really understand what that means at its essence. It doesn't mean just avoiding streets at night because they're dangerous, but it's about understanding, well, why was I going there in the first place? What drove me to do that? Why was I going to dodgy nightclubs at 3 a.m. and ending up in some kind of trouble, whether through drink, drugs, or violence, or theft, or something? Is it really about just avoiding it, or was that actually something my mind was doing in order to move me forward in some way? Was there some treasure in that shadow aspect? So let's move on. I think it's just, in summary, not a popular project, but it's one we sorely need. So in a very brief nutshell, why does self-knowledge matter? Well, as I've alluded to, I think that all of the challenges we face can be construed as challenges of self-knowledge in some way, or spiritual challenges, if you like, whether it's our dysfunctional monetary system, or the destruction of the environments, or war and the multiple wars and skirmishes that are going on around the world right now, or the threat of war in various places, a loss of meaning, whether that's on a personal level or on a societal level. Like a lot of Western cultures where I come from, the UK, I believe that they are suffering from a loss of meaning. The culture itself has a kind of loss of direction or loss of identity. But it's discord between people because, of course, there's always going to be conflict, both internally and externally. That's not a problem per se, but it is a sign of maybe like something that's disagreeable, right? There's an antithesis to someone's thesis. Like something is trying to be resolved, and there's progress behind that. There's the implication of possibility of moving forward to a higher order truth. But to get there, there's challenges, conflict, there's pain, there's suffering involved in that. And that is clearly a spiritual challenge. Something is being denied in oneself. So there's a lack of self-knowledge somewhere. Loneliness, addiction. Why do we get addicted to things? What's going on in our own mind there? Is there some part of us that's not having its needs met? And when was that established? Part of me, what could that possibly mean? Well, there is such a thing as the unconscious, So, this whole idea of the unconscious opens up a whole new realm of understanding. It's like a complete rewiring of the psychic operating system if it's not something that's been, as a concept, incorporated into your understanding. And as much as our sort of modern modus operandi, our modern way of thinking about things, i.e. materialism, it sort of bolts on the understanding of the unconscious, but doesn't really take on board its full implications. Like, what could that possibly mean if there's this field of potential, this hidden realm that's having a bearing on what we experience? And it actually might be fair to say that we belong to it more than it belongs to us. We came from it. So, whoa, talk about a paradigm shift. And its utility cannot be denied, like the understanding of an unconscious mind. But if we really take that line of thinking where it needs to go, it changes everything, right? So this idea that there's actually more to us than meets the eye, we are not just the ego, that's not us. So self-knowledge starts there. That's not even the end of it. That's the very, very beginning. I am not who I think I am. I'm not the idea of self. I'm not the self-image. I'm certainly not the persona. I'm certainly not the mask that I wear. But I may have spent half my life or much of my life believing that to be the case, or at least acting as though I believe that to be the case. That may well have been a viable thesis for some time. But before long, we come up against some pretty serious negation if we insist on that idea. And we must, because it's not true reality. So we have to brush up against the negation of that. And lastly in this list here, I've got codependency listed. I use it as an umbrella term for any situation where people are leaning on each other as a way to regulate their own unresolved tension and feeling, whilst not really taking responsibility for themselves, perhaps because of misunderstanding, lack of understanding, but also possibly conscious willed avoidance as well. We have to acknowledge the reality of that possibility. So all of these can be seen as arising from the minds of people. It might be very interesting to ask 20 or 30 people on the street, what do you think the biggest problem is facing the world today, or let's say Western culture today, to be a little bit less general? What kind of answers might you get? Well, I don't think I'd be surprised to hear the war in Ukraine, or the, let's call it a war, right, in Israel, Palestine, and the implications of that, which could be far wider reaching. Could it be ecocide? Could it be a dysfunctional economy? Well, yeah, a lot of the worldly problems can pretty much be chalked up to a dysfunctional monetary system and a corrupt fiscal policy around the world. The abuse of an idea that is money and currency, and how that advantages a select few people and disadvantages pretty much everyone else, and how everyone else is kept in deliberate ignorance about how it really works. So all of these might well be preconceivable answers, right? But underpinning all of this is a lack of self-knowledge. It's conflicts in the minds of people. Even these massively wide-sweeping challenges that could, well, they have the potential to, in Jung's word, end our civilization. Or in Marie-Louise von Franz's words, total destruction, right? They can all lead to total destruction, potentially. But the way to avoid those, the way to work through those, is to develop self-knowledge. It's for each individual to truly know who and what they are. And that means the essence, having a respect for mystery, rather than trying to superimpose one's will onto the unknown and control it. Kind of the opposite way around. It's understanding that we exist in a very mysterious existence, and there's a kind of humility that must come from that. And only when we open ourselves up to that can we really meaningfully navigate it skillfully, and then knowledge starts to come. True knowledge, like self-knowledge, starts to come from that, in respecting that mystery. Of course, the unconscious is a huge part of that. So over the last several thousand years, there's been many developments in terms of how we relate to nature, obviously agriculture being a huge one, but then quickly superseded by institutional focus, religion being the biggest part of that, like control, order and law. And so sort of two quite different approaches to existence, one very feminine, one very masculine. And what's going to become of this? So this absolute adoration of masculine approaches to things, trying to create complete structure and just pin down mystery and pin down the external world in order to make it obey our will. But how do we know that what we will is really what's good for us? Well, there's a question. And where does that come from? So it starts to break down pretty quickly, even though it's more or less added the net value, I think, for some time. It's created greater opportunities for individuation, for self-knowledge. But that cannot happen until we bring on board its opposite, or bring on board an alternative understanding. And anyone can do this on the individual level. On a societal level, it hasn't begun to happen. It's like, this is why we're having so many problems right now, is because that whole general thesis is reaching its end. It's being negated at every juncture pretty much. And it's bankrupt in many ways. So it doesn't mean it doesn't have value. Of course, it has loads of value, and that's also the point. So hopefully I've made a pretty good case there for why self-knowledge matters. Let's go to a quote by Friedrich Schelling, the largely forgotten but incredibly important German idealist philosopher. He said, "There is in every man a certain feeling that he has been what he is from all eternity, and by no means become such in time." Can anyone relate to this? So self-knowledge is therefore what? Is it the thing that you've been from all eternity? Is it recognizing that? I would say on some level, yes, it is. And that we do have a kind of psychic template, in much the same way as we have a physical template or a physical body and an implicate order within our bodies. We also have a kind of implicate order within our psyche. But that very psyche comes from something deeper than ourselves, which we have a constant connection to. So self-knowledge is all of that. It's coming to know all of this. It's coming to know ourselves as individuals, our potential, our path, where we are in that path, where we are right now. It means being very self-critical, means being comfortable with facing negation, as comfortable as one can be doing that, but nonetheless having a positive attitude towards it, or an understanding attitude towards it. So yes, recognizing we are part of an overall process that's not just involving us. And right down to understanding, as Gibran was talking about, our very atoms, our very details, almost like this snapshot of ourselves, which just as a photograph of you isn't really you, it also kind of is you, right? You can't say it's not you, but you also can say it's not really you. It's an image of you. And in much the same way, our ideas of ourselves are not really who we are. I mean, they are, but they're a pretty impoverished take on what we really are. And then, of course, there's our changing selves through time, but none of that is really who we are, right? It's merely a snapshot. So I want to go now to a quote by Manly Palmer Hall from his book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He said that with the decline of virtue, which has preceded the destruction of every nation of history, the mysteries became perverted, that is, mystery schools and ancient knowledge and wisdom. Indescribable practices, such as the Bacchanalia, were introduced, and perversion ruled supreme. For no institution can be any better than the members of which it is composed. So a number of things stand out here. What initially made me want to show this was, well, his very strong, simple first statement, that the decline of virtue has preceded the destruction of every nation in history. And you see, you cannot truly have virtue without self-knowledge. Not really. I mean, you can follow rules, but you can't really understand what virtue is, what wholesome behavior is, what genuine progress in yourself or in the world around you is. At the same time, a lack of virtue, therefore, is pretty much synonymous with a lack of self-knowledge. And he mentions here, interestingly, the Bacchanalia, which were debaucherous parties in the Roman times at around 200 BC. They were essentially ceremonies of worshipping Bacchus, who is the Roman equivalent of Dionysus. So more on that in a moment. This is the god of wine, of hedonism, of essentially just having a good time. And there's nothing wrong with enjoying yourself, certainly not. However, that can very easily also become a form of self-avoidance. So I don't know if you've looked around lately, or if you've done any traveling to any parts of the world where they don't have this sort of Western materialist, high street, consumerist culture. And it's a very different picture of things, very different. Of course, now with social media being ubiquitous, the examples of non-avoidance and an honest pursuit of self-knowledge are fewer and further between, I would say. And it's very important, therefore, that we do our best to honor it in ourselves. And it really is a personal journey. It really is an individual task. And at the same time, preserve that knowledge. Concentrate on yourself, of course. But then at some point along the way, you think that there's something you can do here to actually preserve the mysteries, but you have to actually know the mysteries. And this is also kind of the point, because it comes back to, how is it that you cannot have virtue without self-knowledge? Well, because unless you really know a thing, unless you've made it conscious, unless you've integrated it and understand it at all levels, well, then you cannot really fully embody that thing. You cannot meaningfully replicate. You cannot meaningfully act on it. You can imitate, and you will fall in love with images of the thing. And this is exactly what we see. This is what evil is. And this is what negation is, right? It's coming up against the dark side of what something is, born out of misunderstanding, born out of lack of integration. So, for example, kindness, love, all these very wholesome qualities. But we don't truly know what they actually are at their essence. We're more likely to fall prey to the mere images of it. We will therefore more easily be able to gratify our own need to be a certain way, to be that way, to aspire to wholeness. But the ego will be more easily tricked by that. It will look for just some kind of sign that it's doing okay. It's a sort of relief. Wherever there's that tension between what one is really doing, what one is really feeling, and how one is presenting themselves. This brings me on to the next slide here. Some of you, the clever ones, might have guessed what it might be already. So this was the recent Olympic ceremony, the opening ceremony, Paris 2024 Olympics. And I'm not going to say anything about whether this represents the Last Supper or not. That's not really what this is about. And I don't want to get too sidetracked here, because this is a whole study, like what this ceremony was about, whether it was consciously done, to what extent it was subliminal, how deep the symbolism goes. But one thing's for sure, this character in blue here represents Dionysus. And I just mentioned Dionysus on the previous quote by Manly Palmer Hall. So this is the god of hedonism, the god of spiritual ecstasy, god of wine, god of parties. And isn't it interesting that Manly P. Hall has also mentioned that it was the Bacchanalia. He actually used this as almost like a symbol of the destruction of the Roman Empire, that there was just complete depravity and self-avoidance, placating tension with alcohol and sense desire, rather than confronting it and transmuting it into something more advanced, or moving forward into greater self-awareness and therefore freedom, rather becoming ever more dependent on kind of things being your way, imposing the idea of self onto the world rather than morphing it in line with experience. So whether or not one is offended by this, I don't think that's really the point. You could consider it actually, if nothing else, merely representative of the lack of virtue of what went into this ceremony, the lack of wholesome qualities, the lack of wholesome intention. This is not an empathic performance. It certainly could look the part, okay? You've got a lot of diversity. You've got people of all races. You've got transsexuals. You've got men wearing women's clothing, women wearing men's clothing. You've got a man coloured in blue, because Smurfs must also be given adequate representation here. All sounds great, right? Doesn't that all sound so lovely? And you better take it on board, and you better watch, right? The world better watch it. Now, this is an example of what I mean by, in not truly knowing a thing, there's this greater inclination to try and look like the thing, try and pretend, and it may not even be conscious, you see, because you don't know what you don't know. And so things often in our world aren't merely not what they seem, we do well to not be duped by them, but they are in fact often the precise opposite of what they seem, because there's a compensation going on. And so what you have here is a lot of packaging around ideas of empathy and inclusion, kindness, acceptance, but the packaging is not the point. And so genuine kindness, acceptance, you don't need to tell people to do it. You don't need to put posters on public transport telling people to be kind. It makes no difference whatsoever. It's actually just hiding what is something genuinely actually quite sinister. And I think this has been one of the clearest demonstrations in our global culture to date of how misaligned things are becoming. There's many reasons for that, which I may well get onto, but just wanted to talk about that, because in the context of what the point is here, this is showing the lack of virtue and therefore the lack of self-knowledge that's going into these things. If only we could get by in life, if only we could achieve the pinnacle of civilization by doing this all day. And it didn't work out very well for the Romans. So in this second image here, this is ostensibly Joan of Arc. But if you've read the Bible, Revelations 6:8, got it here, it goes, "I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him." So here we see a pale horse. We see a river. Is this perhaps the river Styx? And also, I'm not assuming conscious evil intent here by the people that produce this show. In much the same way as a synchronicity might show up in your own life, a curious coincidence, an acausal event between two apparently unconnected experiences. In much the same way, symbolism can be subliminal as well and unintentional, at least by those who are doing it. Now, there may well be some force behind them, conscious or unconscious, but the point is that if coincidence can happen and point you in the right direction, then you better be sure that also this can happen as a reflection of energies that are in play and which aren't necessarily conscious to the people behind it, at least at the front end. So it can go deep, and there are definitely nefarious forces at play, but we do well not to assume or project that where there isn't evidence for it in certain individuals. One note I was going to make on this slide, this is Mary Antoinette, the last Queen Consort of France. obviously without a head, or at least her head is in her hands here. And this is the Conciergerie de Paris, where she was imprisoned. This performance was quite striking. Blood coming out all the windows, red characters, French metal band thrashing it out. There's so much that you can take from this. The band have been on record saying, look, no, there was nothing satanic about it from our point of view, and I'm very inclined to believe them. They clearly had no unwholesome intention there. That also doesn't necessarily matter, okay? And remember that the real meaning is not always the intended meaning. Symbolism operates through the unconscious mind. So even though the people behind this, at any level, may have consciously wanted it to be one way, nonetheless, what comes out, just like a Freudian slip, or just like drawing a piece of art in an active imagination exercise, you cannot produce something that doesn't reflect on some level part of the self. And so therefore it's very important to have self-knowledge. And at the same time, seeing what we produce, seeing what the world produces, seeing what other people produce, gives fascinating insight into the nature of our minds, their minds, and culture at large. If you can understand the symbolism here, you can get to some very useful insights, and you can read what's going on inside your own mind, because that's the most important thing, right? It's to understand what's going on inside yourself, and also the outer shadow work aspect of seeing the world clearly. A study of symbolism really, well, it's essential to that whole endeavor. So this is a quote that I often come back to by Carl Jung, written in 1949 in a letter. And he said that we have not understood yet that the discovery of the unconscious means an enormous spiritual task, which must be accomplished if we wish to preserve our civilization. Very stark words. And in fact, the whole letter is very stark and heavy. And I would like to do an entire video just going through this letter. So I plan to do that very soon. It's very interesting. Written relatively late in Jung's life. He was 74 when he wrote this. And you can feel the pain coming through in his writing. You can feel the concern, the tension, and a very honest and astute understanding of the direction of our civilization. And it doesn't mean that civilization is necessarily going to be destroyed, because after all, what do we mean by civilization? Do we mean USA? Do we mean the world? Do we mean everybody? Civilizations have come and gone many times, and each time have found some way to move forward. And all of that is also unavoidable if we undergo this enormous spiritual task. But it is A, a spiritual task, and B, enormous. And the fact that we haven't even understood yet what the discovery of the unconscious means for us. And this was written in 1949, and you can just as much say the same thing today. Now, I think that has the potential to shift rather quickly and suddenly. It's already shifting, I believe. But there's three key points being made here. First, yes, the discovery of the unconscious. At least in modern terms, that has been kind of a discovery. And it wasn't Freud who discovered it. Freud popularized it. It was actually Schelling, who I quoted earlier, who coined the term, the unconscious. But he was working with a lot of guys like Victor and Hegel, and they were all answering Immanuel Kant, and all of them were really building on an ancient Western mystical tradition that dated back several hundred years before that, and that had its roots in the ancient mystery schools as well. So it's not a new discovery. However, it is certainly a new discovery in terms of the psychological understanding and seeing it in a modern sense. I mean, wow, even materialist science now understands a subconscious and unconscious and tries to model it in a potentially useful way. But it has nonetheless been a discovery, and the implications of it are enormous. And that is what Jung is referring to here. He's talking about the process of individuation itself, becoming undivided in ourselves, because we are divided. And that's why we have all those problems that I referred to earlier. War, ecocide, dysfunctional economies. We are completely divided within ourselves. And that shows up in, sure, division between ourselves, but it's primarily up here. And so resolving that, this process of individuation, in another place, he says, on one hand, it's divesting the self of the persona, and by association also the shadow. So letting go of who we think we are, who we think we have to be for the world, who we feel we've been expected to be, who we have been expected to be, and that we've then introjected or internalized. But on the other hand, also from primordial images. So he's referring there to the archetypes of the collective unconscious, of the objective psyche, and the influence that they are having over us. So it's like the Akashic record, right, of human experience that continues to affect us all. And we must cultivate a relationship with those archetypes. It's very important. It's why we had gods in the ancient civilizations. Religions of all sorts serve some end towards this as well. Whether they're talking about one god or many gods, or even no gods, there's always some engagement with the deepest parts of ourselves. And archetypes aren't something that you can really integrate fully, because you cannot integrate the entire human experience of the feminine or the masculine. You can certainly understand it to a pretty good degree, just as you can understand your partner to a pretty good degree, or your mother or your father or your brother or your sister. You can cultivate a relationship with them, and that's what we must do. That's in part what active imagination is for. Marie-Louise von Franz said in an interview on a similar note, she said, "I think that if not more people try to reflect and take back their projections and take the opposites within themselves, there will be total destruction." A very solemn note here. Self-knowledge is, after all, understanding where we might be seeing ourselves in the world, which is, well, everywhere, really. It doesn't mean that we cannot objectively see what's happening around us. It's, in fact, very important that we do. This is what I refer to as outer shadow work. And the inner shadow work of coming to terms with the parts of ourselves that we find disagreeable, that we have rejected. And how else could we encounter those parts of ourselves if not through projection? And so it's often said, isn't it, that we see what's negative because of survival. Like we look for what's negative. Perhaps, but is it necessarily just survival, or is that ourself trying to realize? Is it our mind trying to realize itself? So it's looking for the salt in the stew, right? It's looking for that negation. And the ego has to do its best to take that on board and learn from it. But if the ego can learn that it has this role in this whole process, and it has this intellectual understanding of what might be going on, that can be very useful too. But also, again, not looking for a quick fix here, understanding that this is an energetic exercise. This is a spiritual task, and it is enormous, and it involves effort and energy, and it's a full-time job. There's no going around it. We're trying to go around it, we're already off to a bad start, because process is the reward in so many ways. So on the topic again of self-knowledge, Erich Fromm said, speaking about Freud, that for Freud, self-knowledge means that man becomes conscious of what is unconscious, making the unconscious conscious, right? This is a most difficult process because it encounters the energy of resistance by which the unconscious is defended against the attempt to make it conscious. So a couple of things to take away here. It's difficult because it's energetic. In just the same way as you need to use energy in the physical world, you have to drive your car around, to walk down the street. Inner work is an energetic process, and that involves emotion, it involves effort, conscious will, and no wonder we often don't like to go there. And so in the absence of complete knowledge of our opposites or our shadow, the ego has no other option other than to render an experience to us that makes sense, right? That appears to bridge that gap somehow, maybe through dissonance, maybe through avoidance, through any number of mechanisms, which leads me on to the second point here about being defended or defense mechanisms. This is a somewhat useful term, but I think it might be worthy of a bit further analysis around what we mean by defending and defense. And is it even a useful term? Is it even an accurate term? Because we have to move forward in steps. We cannot just advance 18 steps at once. Just as the discovery of DNA didn't come until long after the medieval ages, we ourselves cannot become who we really are or acquire complete self-knowledge until we've worked through every step along the way. So in order to do that, we have to, because as Alan Watts says, it's very hard to define yourself, right? We have to split off. We have to put forward a thesis of the world, a thesis of ourselves, And that will always have rough spots. It's a way of kind of navigating mystery, really. So there'll always be something unaccounted for by any thesis we postulate. And that means we will come up against resistance. So yes, it can be a defense, and that can be because there's a willed desire to avoid self-knowledge. There are evil desires imposing oneself on the world, using freedom to violate freedom. And there can also be wholesome intentions, using our freedom to take responsibility, to understand how our challenges can be transmuted, how we can actually use that to increase our own freedom, our own self-knowledge. And so for someone with that attitude, would it really be accurate to describe them as defending when they see something that's unconscious in them, in the world, in someone else? So it's a complicated question, but I just want to say this point here because it's a very difficult process, because it involves an energetic movement, and there's no way around it. There's no quick fix. Quick fixes are really just temporary fixes, and therefore aren't fixes at all. But the good news is that there is a fix, and that is individuation, that is inner work, and it is therefore also the greatest opportunity. It's actually a gift. So in terms of the benefits of self-knowledge, it can kind of help to understand what the opposite would be. So if someone is completely disinterested in self-knowledge, complete disinterest in spirituality, in anything beyond the immediate ego narrative and this self-protective mechanism, then it would kind of be the opposite of the 7 habits of individuation model that I talk about. So rather than taking responsibility for their mind, they would not be taking responsibility for their mind. What that really means is that whenever they encounter a problem, they're actually believing it's always someone else, right? It's always someone else's fault. It's always someone else's problem. And I just deserve to be treated well all the time and have things my way according to my preferences. And whenever that doesn't happen, someone else must be at fault, because the idea of actually doing the effort or doing the work is just untenable to me. Perhaps because that involves some very, very deep trauma. And we've all got trauma, arguably some of a greater magnitude than others. But that can be a real hindrance. But it can also be a lesson once it's fully integrated as well. So moving on to number 2 here, well, the opposite of wholesome intentions would be cruelty, unkindness, right? A lack of empathy, not really interfacing with the world at all. Sure, adapting, communicating, but never using that as a way to mutually transform and truly connect. So very, very rigid persona, all employed with a way to get what I want, or what I have assumed is best for me, but really might well not be. Thirdly, skillful communication. So a lack of self-knowledge would involve speaking unskillfully, speaking at the wrong time, using words that don't really help, telling lies or misdirecting in some way, deception of all forms, right? It's all deception, and so on down the chain. I think one that many of us can relate to is not knowing what to do professionally, really struggling with finding out what our gifts are, what our true purpose is, maybe because we're wanting to meet the needs of our parents or the wishes of society, maybe making some assumptions around that, or maybe there's been some very heavy subliminal communication here, or consequences given when we didn't get the grades that our parents expected us to get, and so on. So we end up submitting to the powers that be and going, fine, I'll be a lawyer or something, right? And then either regretting it for the rest of our lives, or feeling incredibly discontent at work and not really being able to put our finger on why, not knowing any different. This is down to a lack of self-knowledge. And the world is full of temptation, both highbrow and lowbrow forms of temptation. And actually, often what looks like the most wholesome and difficult way towards improvement or progress is often actually just another easy way towards compliance in the world. So it can only be your own road, and that's one reason it's so tricky. So a lack of self-knowledge can get us hung up in any of these ways. Not to mention in our relationships, not knowing how to navigate those, not knowing when our own shadow material is being projected, not realizing when we may actually be serving power as opposed to love, thinking we're serving love when really secretly to ourselves we actually want something. We don't realize that's what we're doing, perhaps. So this is really hard stuff to get through all this. This is advanced stuff, like coming to know this about oneself. And it's emotional work. There's no transformation without pain, without emotion. Self-knowledge also means the ability to bear tension, but also the release of tension. It means living with less conflict. But it also means that when you do encounter conflict, that you don't regard it as a problem in itself. It's not about just living without conflict so much as it's about resolving conflict. And then you'll encounter new conflict and you'll be okay with that because you realize that that is actually pointing the way. So why now? I mean, this is a huge topic, but very briefly, I've already mentioned this, and based on where we are, well, the world in general, but also Western culture, and with science banging its head against the brick wall and not being able to figure things out, and there being a number of almost undeniable instances over the last few years of us being let down by the materialist paradigm and things just proceeding in a very curiously uncanny or symbolic way. So I think a lot of people are starting to question the limits of the current paradigm, and that's understandable because it served us pretty well for a few years. But there's been a lot of philosophers over the last 300 years that have never really subscribed to that model, or whose ideas haven't even begun to be taken on board properly. So you cannot really say that the information wasn't out there even in the mainstream, but it's really a question now of a sort of mass adoption of alternative ideas. Because the alternative idea, there's always been people that have had them, right? But it is necessary now to bridge that gap back again and look back at the self. Aleister Crowley talked about the age of Horus, which broadly correlates to what I was saying there, following on from the age of Osiris being the last 2,000 years, sort of very masculine era, and then the age of Isis prior to that being the more matriarchal era. And so this new era being like the age of the synthesis between those two. It's not about doing one or the other or at the expense of the other. It's about synthesizing. Remember what I was saying here about the point of the exercise versus the packaging, the mere image of something? Well, we now have to take on what it really means to be a man or a woman, or what masculine energy really is, what feminine energy really is. Not merely the appearance of it, not merely simulacras or crass packaging for ideas. We have to really understand what these things are. And you cannot do that merely in words. You have to experience it. You have to get down inside your own mind and really work with it, really experience it, talk to them, cultivate a relationship. Then you start to know it. At least you start to know it better than you did before. And only then can you truly synthesize the truth that comes from both of them. So thank you for bearing with me for what has been more or less an hour here. That's gone on for quite some time. I'd like some feedback from you. Is this format good? Is it too long? Is it too long for a YouTube video? Would you rather have more bite-sized videos? I will be publishing this as a podcast nonetheless. But let me know your thoughts on that. Do you like the visual style, sort of the split down the middle of the screen here? All feedback appreciated. Keep it constructive, please. So what's next for Make It Conscious? I've been working on a program, a self-study program. Thought it was quite a priority that I made some self-study content about active imagination so that you can go away and do that in your own time. There'll be YouTube videos about this too, but to really do the topic a service, I've produced a course. It's about 9 or 10 hours long. I'm not sure at this stage. And it's most likely going to be released in September 2024. Hopefully the other courses will be released then as well. Do my best to adhere to that time frame, but certainly the active imagination course will be released in September. It's actually a 5-part program. So it starts with the Make It Conscious philosophy. That's going to be a free course. And then the active imagination course, which is going to be a standalone course. And then the subsequent 3 courses, you've got inner shadow work, outer shadow work, and then the way of individuation. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings around shadow work. And I want to go into the deeper philosophy of that, including the idealist philosophers and who came before them. And then outer shadow work is rarely talked about in the context of psychology. And this is really coming to see the world clearly, because I think we can get very hung up on this idea of projection, which in itself is a somewhat problematic concept. So I go into that. But also then we have to be able to accurately read the world around us, including what's going on, including world events, and including the people in our lives, and practicing discernment and these such things. So just to say that everything's a projection isn't very helpful there. There has to be a meaningful study of what it actually means to see the world clearly, including other people. And the final course, The Way of Individuation, is mostly about the 7 habits and also how to actually individuate in your own life. So how to bring these ideas into daily life, what to actually do with it. And of course, this is all just a guide for you to incorporate into your own system, because no one else can tell you what to do. But I've pulled together this 7 habits model that is based in philosophical and psychological principles. So I hope, therefore, it can be usefully incorporated into your own life. So the Know Yourself program, that's a 5-part program. And also I meant to say that the final 3 courses are probably going to be sold as a bundle, whereas course 1 is free and course 2 is a standalone offering. I can also add this program down the line. So there's probably going to be other courses as well in future if it's well received. In addition to that, the Inner Work Exercises podcast is now live. It's been going for a few months, and I'm steadily re-releasing all the active imagination exercises from YouTube to the podcast as extended versions. So quite a few of you have expressed interest in longer exercises with longer gaps, and I totally agree. I think that's a really good way to go deeper into the exercise. And so I've honored that by doing this podcast here. It's going to take me another year or so to re-release those. One last thing, Make It Conscious is also now on Instagram and X. So you can follow at Make It Conscious on both platforms. I plan to be releasing more content there steadily. I was very fortunate to be given the X handle by a lady who got it in 2017 and didn't use it. So huge thanks to her, and much appreciated. So I hope you found this insightful, useful, and look forward to seeing you again soon in another episode. Speak to you soon. Thanks.